Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to UCL, to the Department of Political Science. I'm just going to first check with our recording. Higher, okay. So we do not have any microphones in the room, so we're going to have to speak loudly. And when we get to Q&A, we'll ask you to do the same. So on behalf of UCL Department of Political Science and School of Public Policy, I wanted to welcome you to our first Policy and Practice Seminar of this academic year. My name is Veronica Fikvak, and I'm a professor of human rights and international law at the department, and I'm your chair for the evening. The topic for tonight's event is the Security Council's role in international conflict. Why small state diplomacy matters. The UN Security Council was established in the aftermath of World War II, and it was entrusted with the task of ensuring international peace and security. Amid the current escalation in international conflict and a number of different crisis zones around the world, we think it is timely to reflect on the Council's role and its future. Now, whilst debates on Security Council are usually focused on the role that the so-called permanent members, the P5, play, so the US, UK, France, China, and Russia, tonight we'll be reflecting on the role that non-permanent members play, and specifically small states, and what role they have in international diplomacy. In recent years, we've heard a lot about small states' power. For example, on climate change, a commission of small island states is leading the efforts before the International Court of Justice and the International Tribunal of the Sea to clarify the obligations relating to climate change. Small states similarly played a really key role in the recent adoption of the Agreement on Marine Biodiversity, the BBNJ agreement. But small states might also find it harder to engage on the international level. They may have resource issues, capacity limitations, and they may not be able to provide input on every question or every treaty. So our question for today is really how small states are different, what role they play in international diplomacy, and how much influence they have. To help us answer these questions, we are delighted to be joined by Ambassador Simona Leskovar and Sir Mark Lyall Grant. Ambassador Simona Leskovar is a career diplomat from Slovenia. She's got 28 years of diplomatic service. And until August this year, she was the Slovenian Ambassador to the UK, where she was awarded the Diplomat of the Year prize. Before this, she was the State Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs in Slovenia. And among her many notable appointments within the Slovenian diplomatic service, she was the ambassador to Japan and Republic of Korea, and she was also the deputy permanent representative of Slovenia to the United Nations in New York. Currently, she's the program director of the Bled Strategic Forum at the Slovenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. On my other side, Sir Mark Lyall Grant is an ambassador who served at the United Nations as the UK's ambassador and permanent representative from 2009 to 2015. And during his tenure, he was the president of the Security Council 4 times. He subsequently served as a national security advisor during the David Cameron and Theresa May's premierships. Following his retirement from civil service, he's now a visiting professor at King's College London and a strategic advisor. Ambassador Leskovar will speak for about 15 minutes, and she will talk about her own experience in trying to get Slovenia to the Security Council, but also about the role of small states in international security. She'll talk more broadly about her experience in the UK and within the UN. Sir Mark will then provide some remarks in response for about 10 minutes. We will then have a discussion amongst the panel before opening the floor to your questions. I should say before we start that the whole session, including the Q&A, is recorded, and it will be posted on our website, on our YouTube channel, and our podcast. So if you speak, you will be recorded and heard. If you don't speak, you will not. We will share this recording with you once it becomes available, and we hope you'll share it with others. But please now join me in welcoming Ambassador Simona Leskovar.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Thank you for inviting me back. It's more than a month now that I haven't been to London, and it was sweet coming back this afternoon, and it's especially good to be here among the students, because this environment is pretty much different than the environment that I work in right now. So I am looking forward to the Q&A part, and also more than to the question you might pose. I will look forward to your thinking and what you may have to say about the current situation in the world. Let me just say that I'm not an academic, so I will share my practitioner's perspective on representing a small country, small state in a larger state. So it will be about the UK and my previous postings and in the international organizations. But let me just start with one thing. Veronica already mentioned that small states are limited by their powers. I would just want to say one thing, that I'm not sure whether you know, but the last week was a World Cycling Championship in Switzerland. And Slovenian cyclist, the world's best cyclist, Tadej Pogačar, won in the elite. But that's not the only thing it was a great win, but actually in the course of a cycling year, there are 4 major events. There are three weeks turns. So first is Giro d'Italia, second is Tour de France, and the third is La Vuelta, the Spain, and of course the World Championship. And Slovenia of only 2 million people won all 4 this year. So what I am saying is that cyclism maybe is an individual sport, but in reality you cannot win if you don't have the best possible team to support you. And this goes also for the international community. One country, large, small, cannot win or cannot wage or ensure the peace in the international community. Only countries together can do that. And the international community is stronger if the countries play together. Mentioned before, the role of a small state like Slovenia is of course determined by the realistic optics, with limited human resources, with a limited political influence, with a limited economic power, with a limited military power. Also with limited other forms of powers like soft, just sport is one thing, culture is another. And of course with the structural power, where we have more powers, and that's international organizations. In international organizations, countries are, at least on a paper, we all have one vote when it comes to the voting. UN has more than half of its membership consists of small states. There's also a forum of small states that was established 30 years ago and is still led by Singapore. Slovenia is, of course, part of that. Small countries, we have different or varied interests, and that prevents us from forming natural alliances. But we always come together when it comes to concerning our size, and when it comes to the reforms of the organizations. We have, as a small state, always an interest for international peace and prosperity, just like bigger countries. But for us, this is very, very important. Usually, we don't have much of a self-interest in that. Slovenia is not coming to the international organizations with a much of historic or imperialist or no imperialistic baggage. And we act as a responsible actor in international relations. Therefore, for us was always, well, we always strive to be part of various bodies of international organizations like the Security Council, Human Rights Council. And Slovenia is now a member of a Security Council for this year, and next year we just finished our presidency during the month of September. For us, effective multilateralism, that sounds like a cliche sometimes, but for us this is really very important, and it's a multilateral system is a favorable system setting for us, because we find also some security guarantees in that. We, of course, always strive for open international economy, where states can freely trade. For Slovenia, reliance on trade is of the essence. More than 70% of Slovenian GDP is export-oriented. So for us, low tariffs or non-tariffs are very important. I mentioned security aspect. Small states either tend to be neutral or they are seeking the membership in security alliances. That also depends on the historic moment. Slovenia became a member of NATO 20 years back, and we are members of this UN organization since our independence, basically, for 33 years now. What worries us, and this is very concrete also, it's current situation that not just Slovenia, but all small states are facing. This is a challenge between the multipolar and multilateral system. We see today that we have a different level of multipolar world. In military sense, probably we have a unipolar with the US as a major military power. In economy, we have a multipolar world. In digitally, we probably have non-polar, like network, world that states are not managing. I'm speaking about the artificial intelligence, data flows, bitcoins. For us, effective multilateralism means that we can influence, but on the other side also means that we can restrain some larger powers. So rules-based order is essential. We can debate about what does that mean, rules-based, but for us, it was since our independence we strive to be part of that international settings. Small states, I think they don't have much choice or hardly any choice than to have principal positions, meaning promotion of democratic values and norms, respect of human rights, international law, international humanitarian law. I would argue that countries like Slovenia, we have more ability to listen and to understand. and to connect with vulnerable more. It was that was proved also during our latest Security Council campaign 2 years back, when we were competing against another country from our Eastern European group, and we were able to win in the General Assembly with a quite a large majority in the first round of a voting. We also, as I mentioned before, are always want to be a part of these international bodies also because we think that we can be honest brokers. Maybe I can say about that a few words later, if that will be a time to explain what happened in Slovenia a few months back when we decided to recognize Palestine. And that was a question whether we still can be an honest broker. We are usually focused, as a small country, usually focus on a limited set of issues where we see that we can have more power, and we usually also form coalitions with other small countries. One of those were when I was in New York, and Mark was also there, was the reform of Security Council. Slovenia was very vocal on the need of reform of Security Council. And when I was preparing for this event today, I was also going a little bit through my notes from 15 years back, comparing them to today's discussions in the Security Council. I mentioned before Slovenia chaired the Security Council in September last month, and we hold this open debate on the leadership, so why we need to reform and how Security Council, and probably most of the talking or speaking points that we used 15 years back and maybe 15 years back before that, still very, very valid today. From my personal point of view, a small diplomatic force has, of course, limited resources, but we can be more informal, we can be more flexible. Ambassadors sometimes would get a larger autonomy in a decision making. That can prove advantageous in negotiations and also within international settings. We try to prioritize issues, so we don't focus on everything, although sometimes capital would want that we would be omnipresent at all issues, but it's just impossible because of the limited resources. So you try to focus more on the issues that are more important, or that you build coalitions with other smaller like-minded countries. This is also what I realize, that small countries does not have the arrogance of a larger state. And beside the modesty, we enjoy the high level of social solidarity. And I will here also give you one piece of, one example. For instance, when Slovenia had floods last summer, and 2/3 of the country was basically flooded. And of course, European Union came to our rescue and help us. But most of the help came from the smaller countries. And first help came from smaller countries. And also, just a week ago when there were wildfires in Greece again and in North Macedonia, Slovenia also reacted in a matter of hours. What are the downsides of a small country? of course, bigger transactional costs. Things cost more if you do them individually. Another one is provincialism. Sometimes we are, we have some barriers to see further. That can be a flip side of modesty that I mentioned before. Sometimes we are more fearful confronting the bigger states, especially if they are neighbors, and this is also when Slovenia has also some experience with that from the past. If we want to think big as a small country, we need to have a good educational system. We are lucky with that in Slovenia. Then next to that, we have a lot of possibilities to go study abroad, with the education compensate also the narrowness of the local horizon. We learned foreign languages. We have to. I mentioned we are a country of 2 million. We, as diplomats from smaller countries, usually are more generalist than expert in certain matters or regions. We are professional, of course, best educated that can come to the diplomatic service. Sometimes, and this is also my own experience, this personal activity and engagement from a diplomat from a smaller country is more important, or they engage those diplomats or invest more in these personal activities and relationships, which are in diplomacy very important. We easier to adjust. I mentioned that before. Also, some dependencies are easier to be changed if you are coming from a small country. But still, you can develop powers that disproportionate relative to our size, so we can still punch above our weight. We also can offer useful platforms for others to come together and to negotiate. And I'll tell you my own experience here in London, that I want to say was known, because there are few of my colleagues here, but I think all that I see around you experience that with me. I tend to host lunches and dinners at my place. My residence was not huge, but it has a wonderful view, so people like to come to my place. Mark was also a guest of mine sometimes, and at those, at those events, I mean, we many times we had interesting guests. We shared informations, we shared views, we shared experience, and that is in diplomatic service is very, very important, and also at the end of the day contributes to a better world. I have more talking points prepared, but I will leave it there. Maybe for further discussions, maybe to say a few words about the difference between bilateral and multilateral service after.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Mark?
Thank you very much, Veronica. So I'll focus primarily on the United Nations end of diplomacy, because it is the intergovernmental organization of universality. You know that more than 50% of countries in the world have less than 10 million people, which is the UN definition of a small country. So more than half the countries in the world are small, and a third have less than 5 million. And as Simona says, small countries on whole, in my experience, are more committed to multilateralism and the rule of law than the big, powerful countries, because they've got the most to lose from a return to the jungle way, and might is right. You know, when I first went to New York, I was very surprised that there was much more antipathy to the G20 than there was to the G7. Because countries at the UN said, look, if the rich countries want to go and meet among themselves and have a fireside chat, that's fine. But the G7 has aspirations to take decisions that should be taken at the UN. And some of the small countries' champions had joined the G20. Countries like Brazil and India and China were part of the G20, and suddenly there was a separate forum sucking authority potentially away from the United Nations. So there was much greater antipathy to that than there was to the G7. Now, one of the unusual features of the UN, which is not widely recognized, I think, that particularly outside the Security Council, small states play a disproportionately large role. Because it's not just a question of, in the General Assembly, it's one country, one vote. You know, with India, 1.5 billion people's got one vote. Tuvalu, 11,000 people, has one vote. It's not just that. It's just that the UN system works on the basis of facilitation of negotiation. The Secretary General, before each big negotiation, whether it's on sort of climate change, the SDGs, biodiversity, the Arms Trade Treaty or whatever, he chooses a facilitator from the north and from the south. And he inevitably chooses small countries, because you'll never get a big country chosen for that role, because that will upset someone. So it's always smaller countries. So for instance, when you had the Sustainable Development Goals to eliminate poverty, it was Kenya and Denmark were the two countries chosen to do that process. And most of those processes take forward in that way. When I was in New York for 6 years, San Marino ambassador was the chair of the ambassadors group, so had sort of outsized influence. The president of the General Assembly is always chosen from a small country. So we've just had Dennis Francis from Trinidad and Tobago, and he was replaced last year by Philemon Yang from the Cameroon. So outside the Security Council, you have a very positive dynamic for small countries. Now, inside the Security Council, it is different, because there it is a power dynamic. But even so, if you look at the Security Council membership this year, you've got 5 countries on it that have less than 10 million, of whom 2 have less than 1 million population, Guyana and Malta. And in my time at the UN, some of the most effective Security Council members came from small countries. I can think particularly of Guatemala, Luxembourg, and Uganda. Now, there aren't obvious countries you'd think that would play a big role in the UN Security Council. But 2 things are required to do that. The first is you have to have a very effective ambassador if you're going to play that role as a small country. Now, Simona instantly talked about small countries. Ambassadors often have more autonomy. We used to say when we were lobbying for votes or for resolution or whatever in New York, the countries were divided into 3. A third of the world, the ambassadors received instructions from their capitals and they followed those instructions. 1/3 didn't receive any instructions from their capital and so could make up their own mind. And the last third got instructions from their capital but could make up their mind anyway. And you had to know in order to know what to lobby. And I spent my life telling London, for God's sake, don't go and lobby in Jamaica or wherever, because the ambassadors promised to support us. If you go and lobby, you might get a completely different decision. So that is the role that ambassadors have, that sort of autonomy, as Simona said. So the first thing, you need a really good ambassador. But the other thing is you need a very clear plan and focus. So many countries spend years, sometimes more than 10 years, Simona will tell you, lobbying in order to get on the Security Council. They arrive on the Security Council for 2 years, they are so exhausted, they don't have any plan, they don't know what to do, and before they know it, those 2 years are up, and they're thinking about the next time they can get on. So the countries I mentioned, I mean, sometimes that focus can be subject specific. So Guatemala, ambassador, very focused on human rights and international law. Luxembourg, very focused on children in armed conflict. Or you can be positioning. So the Uganda ambassador, he had been a very senior minister in Kampala, and he played a role as a sort of peacemaker between different factions of the P5, for instance, and played that role very effectively. By contrast, apologies if I offend anyone, one of the least effective countries in my entire time, India. Completely useless. Their only objective from getting onto the Security Council was to stay on it permanently. As a result, they achieved absolutely nothing during their 2 years on the Security Council. But even outside the Security Council, small countries can influence Security Council. I'm thinking in particular of Liechtenstein's initiative, which has been successful, which is to force P5 members who use the veto to go to the General Assembly and justify that veto. A small step, you might argue, but nonetheless quite a significant one. And even the regular vetoers, Russia, China, the United States, do go to the Security Council to justify their vetoes now, which never happened previously. Also, to contribute fully, you need quite a good team in your mission. I'm sure Simona would agree this. The trouble is, in the Security Council, it covers so many issues in a very short period of time that it's very difficult to have enough people to be experts on everyone, as Simona just said. So in an average month, the Security Council will probably have 30 meetings in the month on 15 or 20 different issues. You have to have a very big mission to have one person per issue in that case. And that's when you have to use the sixth permanent member of the Security Council. No one really talks about the sixth permanent member of the Security Council, but the Secretariat is a permanent member of the Security Council. They don't vote, but they're extremely influential and normally speak first. Now, they always used to speak last, interestingly. In the old days of the Security Council, the member states would all speak, all 15, and then the Secretariat would speak. Now, before every debate, the Secretary General or his representative will actually speak first and influence the debate right at the start of the meeting. So they are a very important P6 member, and small states can piggyback on that or on another permanent member as well. And that is actually a much better idea than it sounds. It's not making yourself dependent on a permanent member. It enables you to do things that you can't do otherwise. People are slightly surprised by the fact that 80% of all documents drafted and adopted by the Security Council are drafted by just 3 countries, the so-called P3, the United States, the UK, and France. Now, we know why Russia and China don't initiate any text, because they're in defensive mode. They're status quo powers. They don't actually want to use the international system to do anything. They want to prevent it doing stuff. So that's not surprising. But slightly more surprising is that elected members to the Security Council don't actually take the pen. Now, when they come on the council, on the whole, small countries, they say, well, we want to hold the pen. You know, we're discussing a lot of African issues. Why isn't an African member of the Security Council holding the pen? When we offered that on numerous occasions to an African country, say, okay, why don't you take the pen on this particular issue, maybe the DRC or the Lord's Resistance Army or Central African Republic, all of which are on the Security Council agenda, they say, oh, we don't have the capacity, we can't do that. So, but you can insist on being a co-drafter. So you can piggyback on maybe France would be normally doing Central African Republic for obvious historical reasons. And you can then have an African country that can be involved in that process as well. Also not well known is that all the subcommittees of the Security Council, because the Security Council has 20 or so subcommittees, often committees on sanctions, things like that, regimes. All of those are chaired by elected members, so not permanent members of the Security Council, and that gives you quite a serious platform to influence events, and also means that you speak first in the Security Council on those issues where you're presenting a report on that subcommittee work. Now, at the moment, obviously the UN Security Council is completely paralysed because of what's happened in Ukraine and partly what's happening in the Middle East, and we're sort of back to a Cold War situation where the Security Council was unable to be particularly effective in resolving international conflicts, let alone preventing international conflicts. And after a golden period that only lasted, unfortunately, about 25 years, from 1989 to about 2015, we've now gone back into a sort of Cold War mentality, which is relatively recent, as I say, because even when, for instance, I was in New York and we were hammering the Russians every day on annexation of Crimea, say, in the afternoon you could still work with the Russians when you were talking about Mali or Democratic Republic of Congo. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case today. So the divisions in the Council have seeped into all those other issues, and so it's getting very difficult to do any serious business on international peace and security. Hence, the renewed interest in Security Council reform. But let me just say a word about that. Simona rightly said that the debate hasn't moved on much in 40 years, and frankly, it probably won't move on much in the next 10 to 15 years. Why? And this is an interesting question people don't think about. There are two reasons why it doesn't happen. One is China, and one is the Africans. China is of the P5 countries the most opposed to Security Council reform. We used to discuss it among the 5 ambassadors quite regularly when I was in New York. The British and the French saying, we think it's time for Security Council reform, we favour Security Council reform. The Americans would say, well, we don't take a policy decision because it's not on the agenda immediately. Let us know when it's a realistic possibility, then we'll take a position. The Russians said, well, we're not particularly enthusiastic about it, but we don't have any particular objection to those countries that were likely to become permanent members. China said, absolutely not. You know, one of the least diplomatic things I heard in my time in New York, and I heard plenty, was the Chinese, I think it was the deputy ambassador, stood up in a General Assembly resolution just after the Japanese ambassador had given the case for why Japan deserved to be a member of the Security Council, and the Chinese deputy ambassador stood up and said, let me be very clear, you cannot change the results of the Second World War with a UN General Assembly resolution. Why did China take that position? Well, because they know that any expansion of the Security Council would obviously include India, would obviously include Japan, and at the moment they have a monopoly in Asia, and they don't want that to be disturbed. Which is the same reason that Russia is not that fussed, because none of Russia's neighbours in that way would be involved directly. Africa is a separate problem, and it's a sort of Anglophone, Francophone problem, because the Africans can't agree among themselves on which 2 countries would be permanent members. Because the obvious 2, maybe you'd think, is South Africa and Nigeria. They're both Anglophone, so that's obviously not acceptable. And who's going to do it? So they've hit on this idea of rotating permanent seats, and that's where the Americans put in a veto and said, no, yes, we agree, we can consider 2 permanent African seats, but we can't have rotating seats. We have to know who are the permanent members. So much as I think it's highly desirable that we have Security Council reform, we need it for a variety of reasons, I don't think it will happen. And I just add a final warning to small states that not only would it make issues more difficult to agree on even than it does now, because more vital interests would be affected, particularly if the new permanent members got the veto power, but also it would make it even more difficult for small countries to get elected onto the Security Council, particularly if we have the reform that is the most realistic reform in the foreseeable future, which is longer rotational seats for certain countries. So instead of coming on for 2 years, the Germanys and Japans and Brazils and South Africas would come on, say, for 5 years at a time. And that would squeeze out even more space for the smaller countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of you for those really interesting thoughts. So I wondered on your message on the Security Council was that it is now sort of stuck in a time that one could label the Cold War situation. And so I wondered, and this goes to both of you, why does diplomacy in this moment, given the problems we've got, the conflicts we've got happening, why does it matter? And how is it different? How are the activities that one engages as a diplomat, how are they different for small states versus a P5?
I would argue just because of the situation that we are in, we need diplomacy and we need diplomats. Because, as I mentioned earlier, no single issue, be it a conflict situation or potential conflict situation or a challenge like climate change that can actually cause conflict situations, causing already, can be solved single-handedly or by only one country. So we will always need a cooperation. And therefore, from the small member states' point of view, diplomacy matters. And therefore, as I mentioned, and as Mark said it also, having the multilateral system that is working, the universal organization that is functioning, is very important for small member states, because that's the only way that we can play by the rules, that all member states need to play by. And I mean, as much as a gloomy situation is right now in New York and in the Security Council, I talked to the Slovenian Prime Minister and National Security Advisor on Monday while preparing for this, asking them how was the last week in New York for the general debate opening, for the high-level week. For the debates in the Security Council. There were plenty, not just the main open debate, but there were also briefings on Ukraine, on Middle East, on Lebanon, that Slovenia chaired. And our National Security Advisor said one thing to me. Well, that was the first visit of a Prime Minister to New York, and he said one thing to me. He said, you know, when we arrived on Monday, to the UN when it all started, the summit started, so it was all very inspiring. The next day and the day after, when we had debate after debate, meetings after meetings, it was very frustrating, and they left Friday frustrated. So as Mark and I chatted before it started, I said that the situation is very frustrating for a small member state. Mark said that it's even more for a bigger or a larger states. And therefore, that's why we need to endure. Diplomacy is there to help solve the crisis situations.
So you need to be an eternal idealist.
Well, I would add there's a lot of diplomacy going on there. Yeah. It's just the Security Council is paralysed, but not all diplomacy happens inside the Security Council. As we know from the climate change and biodiversity agreement, the Pact for the Future, which was agreed this last month. And today you'll have seen that Britain has just negotiated with Mauritius and agreed to hand over sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius after 15 rounds of negotiation, the previous government and this government. So very successful, peaceful, sort of concluded by diplomacy. So there's a lot of diplomacy going on. It's just in the Security Council, these really big conflicts which are entrenched. But also, every conflict ends in some form of agreement eventually, and that's where diplomacy comes in. So even in the Middle East, even though President Biden must be deeply frustrated that he hasn't been able to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza, a ceasefire in Lebanon, or to restrain the Israeli government, nonetheless there's a huge amount of thinking going on behind the scenes about what happens in the end game, what is the exit strategy, where's the diplomatic off-ramp. And the same is true, obviously, in Ukraine, people thinking about what happens when the fighting stops. So it may not be obvious and upfront in the Security Council, but there's still a lot of diplomacy going on.
Did you want to add anything?
No, I just want to say that not everything is displaying in front of our eyes. A lot of is going. I mean, it's happening. We don't see it. Or
Behind closed
Yeah.
doors. So I think most of the students in our room are probably students of politics, and I wondered if there's a way for you to explain what is the distinction between diplomacy and politics. So what makes you unique to the politicians that you work with or for?
Well, I will say it from the practitioner point of view. It's the politics makes policies, like foreign policy, and diplomats execute that. Thank you. And politics and diplomacy actually complement each other, stimulate each other, because a lot of diplomatic happenings should look like at the end as a political successes and vice versa. So for me as a career diplomat, I see this distinction. So politics would make policies and diplomats would execute them.
You're the implementers.
Yeah, it's not, if you saw the Diplomat series on the Netflix, it's not like that.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Look, this isn't a careers seminar, but when I talk about careers, I say to students, if you want to change your locality, you want to change your country, you want to change the world, then politics is the right profession to go into. You don't get that directly in diplomacy. You're at one remove from that, as Simona says. But if you want a meritocratic profession where your personal skills and things will help you get on, then for God's sake don't go into politics, at least not in a democracy, like the UK, because it's very arbitrary. It's not based on necessarily personal qualities. It's a lot of luck and timing and all sorts of different issues come into play that don't in many professions and don't in diplomacy. So there is a clear distinction between the two professions, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I will now open the floor for questions. So we'll collect 3 and we'll do several rounds. Yes, sir, there. You need to speak loudly because we don't have microphones.
Thanks very much for the talk. I'm here as a Shinkovets. I've got dual passport, Slovenian. There's a bit that I was expecting you to talk about today which wasn't discussed, which is Hungary and Austria. So both of those just clipped the 10 million mark, so small states by the definition. And I think of them in the context of your remark about Slovenia's provincialism, which I think can, in small states, spill into chauvinism or concern about culture because it's a small country, etc. And both those countries are now really going strongly in that direction. Austria last week and Hungary with Orbán. And their position is to just ignore the diplomats. I think don't want to have anything to do with the United Nations and others. And yes, as you say, small states need to find partners, but they go to the Soviet Union, they just go wherever is best for their own power and their own position. So can you speak a little about how small states can actually lead things awry if they're in the right position and have the power to do that.
Thank you. There was a question there, yeah?
So I just have one for both the panelists. Firstly, it's a simple one. When you started in diplomacy, are you more or less optimistic about the UN's potential to kind of affect change? And then secondly, one for Sir Mark. You mentioned about Security Council reform and the UK being relatively positive about it. Is that really the case? I struggle to see in this kind of political environment that the UK would relinquish any form of international influence in the Security Council. And is it not easy just to say that because China's very against it, we can be very for it, and so the small states will be more kind of friendly towards us?
Thank you. Sir, yeah.
I just wondered, given you've mentioned we're now sort of back in a Cold War era, whether there's a yearning perhaps to go back to the non-aligned movement, and particularly with Tito's role in that. And if you have any observations on that.
Thank you. Would you like to go first? Sir Mark?
I'll leave Simona to talk about Austria-Hungary, but I would only point out that, I mean, that sort of chauvinism you're talking about is not completely limited to small countries. But I agree with you, there is perhaps a greater risk in small countries, but I'll leave Simona to answer that one. Look, I am still very positive about the United Nations. Of course, it has a lot of flaws, and it had these flaws from the beginning, and those flaws were built into the design of the United Nations deliberately, because of the earlier failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations failed to prevent the Second World War because it was not, the big countries refused to join it, and those who did left very quickly. So in order to make sure that every country would join the United Nations after the Second World War, they were given this privileged position of having a permanent status and a veto. And that was the only way. If you took away, let's be very clear, you take away the veto from the United States or Russia, not that that's possible without their agreement, of course, they would leave the UN. I say that quite confidently. So that is the price you pay to keep the UN as a completely universal organization. And it's worth noting that it is universal still. Switzerland only joined the UN in 1975 or something. It hasn't always been there. Saudi Arabia was semi-detached until very recently from the UN. So the first thing every new country does now is join the United Nations. So that universality is extremely important. The UK position is a genuine position, and it's been shared by different governments going back many, many years. But that does not mean we're not volunteering to give up our permanent seat or our veto, let's be clear. We're saying we should expand and enlarge the Security Council, preferably without vetoes, but we're open to discussing that as well, but not to actually take away our position. So there's no reason for us not to be very positive about it. Britain is very confident. We're still the 6th largest economy in the world, etc. We would still be justified in terms of the hard power dynamics to be a permanent member. As a British diplomat, I certainly don't hanker back to the NAM. It was a complete nightmare for us at the United Nations, so we're delighted to see it gone, to be honest. You still see remnants of it in what's called the G77 plus China, which used to be 77 countries. It's now 128 countries, plus China, with China desperately pretending to be a poor developing country to be part of that sort of bloc. And that dynamic still has a certain NAM quality about it, which is not always just easy to break through. But I think as we move into a more multipolar world, we're seeing very, very different interests. And I just give one example, say, LGBT rights and women's rights. Very strong support for that in Latin America, for example. Rather weaker support for it in Africa and downright opposition in places like Russia and China. So, you know, that breaks across a whole lot of NAM dynamics on those sorts of specific issues. And we're beginning to see that more and more on different subject matters.
Well, what I would add is, I mean, I will not speak about Austria and Hungary domestic situation. I only can say they are neighbors, and our relations with them are still solid and multiple because they are neighbors. But I will say what, I mean, in a way that you ask how the small countries can also lead is Slovenia can be an example. I mean, we lead with our own example of how to first respect human rights, democratic values and norms, international law, humanitarian law, how to also remind others that this is important, how to help others, especially in the region, in the southeastern Europe, to develop and to become part of the Euro-Atlantic family, help others also that are more east, including Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia. Speaking about our contribution to that in the Security Council, Mark mentioned that small members can be co-holders of a pen. So we are that co-pen holder with the US on Ukraine in the Security Council, and this is where I think that small countries can help small countries that need help to progress, to become part of various organizations in the Euro-Atlantic arena like EU or NATO.
More questions? At the back? Yeah.
Share your assessment on the role of the expansion of the BRICS Forum, and especially with the introduction of countries such as Iran to the BRICS. Is it bound to become much more confrontational to the G7G regions because of the countries that are now part of it? And lastly, do you think the BRICS Forum will play a role in UN reform going into the future, especially as they are far greater share of the global economy?
Thank you. Yes, there at the back as well.
Just to expand a little bit on basically,
Sorry, could you speak slightly more louder?
some have talked a little bit on the fact of the future, part of the future. Basically, just to expand a little bit onto the one of the sentences, the UN's role in international conflict. I'd like to ask if probably where is the UN moving forward in the future in respect to conflict? Is there a possibility that AI will impact how it involves itself with the conflict zones?
Okay, thank you. And there was a lady there, yeah?
You talked about how some members of the UN join for 2 years the Security Council. But how does it work? Because for me, only the permanent members were part of the Security Council of the UN.
Sorry, I didn't catch
Yes,
that.
I didn't.
It's about explaining the mechanics
I
of
thought
the
you
permanent
talked about
basis.
some members joining for 2 years the Security Council. But how does it work? Because I thought only permanent members were in the Security Council.
I'll take one more, yeah.
You mentioned that, thank you, my questions are more for international development on that area. So what would be, in general, what would be the reform that the UN needs to have to be stronger and to have a better impact on the current Cold War situation that is happening? So similar to this question, but more like moving on, what needs to happen? And the other question is on CSW, which is the Commission of the Status of Women, that happened in March, that the UN hosted. basically, you mentioned that one of the big assets or things that happen is LGBTQ or the topic around that. I think one of the main issues is that countries were not able to agree on the concept of family. So again, like, what can we do to make it happen, to have an agreement on that? Because if the basic is not there, then a lot of the agreements on the CSW fall into the cracks. So.
Okay, thank you.
Well, on the Security Council, perhaps I should have said, I mean, there are 15 members of the Security Council, 5 are permanent members, and 10 are elected for 2 years on a regional basis. And even the regional basis is very bizarre and anachronistic. Simona mentioned that she was competing against another Eastern European country. I don't know which one it was, but Slovenia is in the same regional grouping as Belarus, for instance, which is not sort of obvious now that they're members of the European Union. So they are slightly strange regional groups, but that's how it works. 10 are elected for 2 years on a regional group basis. So there's always 3 African members that are elected. There's always 1 Arab, either in North Africa or not in North Africa, depending on the rotation, things like that. So that's how that works. The BRICS is very interesting. It'll be very interesting to see how it develops. As you say, they've expanded to a number of interesting countries. Argentina declined to join, but 5 others have agreed to join. But the BRICS has not yet turned into much more than a talking shop. It doesn't have the cohesion of the G7, for instance, and doesn't issue as much relevant or influential documentation as the G20 does, for instance. So it may develop in those directions, and it'll be interesting to see, but I think it's just too early to say what impact it will be. Clearly, what we are seeing, though, is the growth of a number of rival institutions, largely instigated by China, but not exclusively. Things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS, the One Belt, One Road, etc., the significance of which is that none of them includes the United States. And clearly that is part of a wider Chinese strategy of developing potential alternatives to the Western established organizations. I don't think it will have much impact on reform of the UN for the reasons that I mentioned a little bit earlier, but I think it might have an impact on reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, some of the international financial institutions, given, as you say, the economic weight of the BRICS Plus, as it's now called. I'll leave to Simona maybe the AI and others, but I did want to just touch on the 2 other questions. One is the development. We shouldn't forget the role of the Secretary General. And one thing that can change is the role of the Secretary General. I mean, we always used to say, as sort of a joke really, but it's true, that, you know, the Secretary General is more Secretary than General. Because it is an intergovernmental organization, the UN. It's not like the European Union. The European Union is a supranational organization with a legal personality, which of course was one of the reasons behind the Brexit debate and all that. It does take sovereignty away from the member states. The UN does not do that. So the UN can only be as strong as the member states want it to be. And traditionally, the powerful members of the UN do not want the Secretary General to be strong. I should have mentioned the Secretary General almost always also comes from a small country, that's sort of by tradition, but not always the most powerful individual, and that is a problem. So I think one thing that really would change is if the Secretary General was given a little bit more license by member states to actually try and do what the Charter says he should do around conflict prevention, not just that, but you know, everything else, climate change, development, and all those other issues that the UN deals with. So that's an area that I would look at, changing the rules for electing the Secretary General. And that might be possible, certainly a lot easier than changing the Security Council. Commission for Status of Women, as you say, it happens every March. But let me take you back to another document, because for me this was a seminal moment at the time I was at the UN and explains a lot of international developments since. That there's something called the Beijing Platform of Action, which you may have heard of, which is a basic document of women's rights. And it was agreed in Beijing in 1995. And I was in the UN in 2015. And we wanted to celebrate Beijing plus 20, so the 20th anniversary of the Beijing Platform of Action. By 2015, the sort of pushback had reached such a stage that not only was it not really possible to celebrate with any consensus or enthusiasm the 20th anniversary of the Beijing Platform of Action, it would not have been possible to negotiate that document in 2015 that had been agreed by consensus in China 20 years earlier. And that, to me, was a vivid demonstration of the pushback against the sort of post-World War international order that had happened between 1989, the end of the Cold War, and 2015. And that's why I say that period only lasted about 25 years.
Add to the Security Council and the composition and how the 10 elected members come in from 5 regional groups. We were debating that for many years when we became member of the the United Nations, that Slovenia might join the other regional group, not being part of the Eastern European group that we are. But then at the end of the day, we figured out that if we would join VIOC, for instance, where we thought or where we think we would belong,
So
would be even more difficult for us to get elected member of the Security Council. So these regional groups in the United Nations are particularly there for countries being elected to different bodies. They don't have members of those groups don't have much in common. They don't agree on various issues. However, Security Council is polarized right now. The E10, so elected members, are working closely together, and that they are much more united, giving them more powers to influence. But this change from year to year when the new members are coming in. I just want to add to the role of the Secretary General also and the election that's also is, it's not written, but it's kind of a rotational base of the, from which region Secretary General would come. It was argued 10 years back that the Eastern European group didn't have the Secretary General yet, and it was a lot of commotion 10 years back with the candidates from the Eastern European group. However, not successful. Not successful yet to have a female leader of the organization, but it's also something that is noting that not many female were the President of the General Assembly. A President of General Assembly is also elected in the General Assembly by member states, also rotates on a geographic base, but I guess that we have only 4 in 79 years. So it's one of the Slovenian initiative that we joined recently, because we have a female president of the country, is to support more women on these leading positions in the United Nations. I just want to say one thing that we were discussing before, if it was not a question, but when Mark mentioned the so-called 6 permanent member of a Security Council, a secretariat, here also small member states can have a very influential role, because small member states always try to get into the secretariat with their best individuals. So having that is also very important tool of influence. Artificial intelligence is not a topic of the Security Council yet, although I think the UK was the first country bringing it in last year. And we were also very keen to take that further, but we are still in the Council for another year, so it might happen. Slovenia will hold another presidency at the very end of its membership, so next December.
I'll take another round as the last one.
I think it's probably better wrap
Can
it
I
up.
take 2?
One maybe.
I can take one question. Okay, there's a persistent lady. Please.
You mentioned informal discussions and diplomacy that happens in spaces outside of the UN. So I was just wondering that the impact this has on smaller countries and their ability to get areas across. Is this something that's beneficial for these smaller countries, or are they actually better off kind of getting their aims at this more informal diplomatic space like the UN?
Well, it's a slight error to think that there isn't any informal negotiations at the UN, because actually all the negotiations happen informally in private, more or less. What you see on the TV screens is set speeches in the Security Council open session, where everyone is just reading a script. So they're just stating their position. But, for instance, the debate last night on the Middle East, which I watched a lot of, it's very dull because everyone just repeats their position. But then the president says, we will now go to consultations. And just the 15 members of the Security Council then go to a back room behind the public room, and that's where the serious negotiation takes place. And that is a very different dynamic from the open session, where you get really sort of important horse trading. And that's true of all the negotiations really that happen at the UN. They don't really happen in public. They happen in smaller groups. And it depends who those smaller groups are, whether small states are members of those small groups or they're not. But the most pushy, as it were, of the small states make sure that they are in those groups where the discussions are really taking place, and the best ambassadors will ensure that they are in the room when there's a smaller discussion going on.
And sometimes that is a challenge for a smaller member states with less diplomats at their mission, because as Mark mentioned, there are various debates, informal debates that are going on in the United Nations simultaneously. So to cover everything, to be present everywhere, it's a challenge for a smaller missions. So sometimes it's good to be friend with others, with other diplomats that they will tell you, or sometimes they also can speak on your behalf, or you can speak on behalf of other countries. But it's this is the way how you get to the final result. So sometimes to break to a smaller group to bring the negotiations to the successful conclusion.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for sharing your experience, expertise, and giving us food for thought. That's all we have time for today. Now, before we thank our speakers, we would like to invite you to a reception at our building just across from this building in Gordon Square. We'll have people taking... Yeah, super. So follow the crowd. The second thing is, I just wanted to remind the students that we have another policy and practice event on Thursday, the 10th of October, which is going to be entitled, What Should We Learn from Britain's Race Riots? And you can sign up for that online. Obviously, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. where we will announce all of our events that are forthcoming. Thank you to the speakers and thank you.